Aung San Suu Kyi's democratic dream is underway in Myanmar, but does it include the country's Rohingya Muslim minority? Also on today's programme, stalemate in Ukraine as political squabbling delays the formation of a new government. And in Picture This, shutdown in India-administered Kashmir after a confrontation between security forces and protesters turns violent. Hello and welcome to the Newsmakers with me, Matthew Moore. Last month, history was made as a new civilian-led government was sworn in Myanmar after decades of military rule. After more than a decade under house arrest, democracy icon Aung San Suu Kyi has risen to the forefront of politics. Although barred from the presidency, she will lead the country from her position as state counsellor. She's pledged to release all political prisoners as part of a wide-ranging reform process. But this democratic transition has yet to include the country's Muslim minority. Hundreds of thousands of Rohingya Muslims were barred from voting in the elections, and many still live in camps, segregated from society. Today's newsmaker, then, is Aung San Suu Kyi, as we ask if she can change the fate of the Rohingya.
A country left divided by years of religious conflict. A people left stateless who say they've been persecuted for decades. After oppression under military rule, there's now hope and some expectation that the Muslim Rohingya can have a better future. At the moment, they aren't recognised as citizens in the country of their birth. And conflict in 2012 between Buddhists and Muslims forced more than 100,000 Rohingya to live in camps where they remain cut off from the rest of society. With a new civilian-led government now in power in Myanmar, we came to Rakhine State to see whether anything will change. Fences and checkpoints have separated Myanmar's religious communities in Rakhine State for nearly 4 years. Buddhists and Rohingya Muslims divided by suspicion and barbed wire. And for the Muslims now stuck in camps, like Norjan, there is little to look forward to. Cut off from the outside world and surrounded by hostile neighbours, she's trapped in a place called Ong Mingala. It's effectively a prison. The authorities say the Rohingya can't leave here to protect them from the Buddhists outside. Since 2012, it's been so difficult, so hard to survive, she tells me. Everyone is unemployed in my home. The building has almost collapsed. In a separate camp, young widow Hassana holds a picture of her husband with her children. Her family says he was murdered by a Buddhist mob in the violence nearly 4 years ago, and they now have little hope for the future. Myanmar's former military-backed government made little effort to heal the wounds. In Sitwe, before the violence of 2012, Buddhists and Muslims used to live side by side, but there have always been tensions. While most Rohingya say they've lived here for generations, Buddhist nationalists have long argued that they are immigrants, mainly from Bangladesh. That's the view of leading monk Shishati. He tells me there is a need to build mutual trust, but in the next breath says many Rohingya should be kicked out of the country. We have to determine which Muslims can be citizens and which cannot, he says. Muslims created this situation and we cannot trust them. Each new generation here is being brought up to distrust the communities around them. Ending years of suspicion will be difficult. We don't want to have problems, but we want to be separate, this man says. If we don't live together, things will be okay. Myanmar may have taken steps towards democracy, but Rohingya Muslims aren't yet part of it. The legacy of violence between Buddhists and Muslims still haunts the country, and rebuilding trust between neighbours who once killed each other will take years. The Rohingya hope the country's new democratic leaders will try to heal the wounds. Duncan Crawford, The Newsmakers, Rakhine State, Myanmar.
Joining me now from London to discuss the Rohingyas' plight and what Aung San Suu Kyi can or will do to help, in London is the president of the Burmese Rohingya organisation in the UK, Tun Kin. Also in the British capital is Penny Green. She's the director of the International State Crime Initiative. Penny Green, if we could just start with you. You took a team of experts to Rakhine State last year, and you stayed there for a number of months examining exactly what was going on the ground. Tell us what you saw there.
We visited the camps where at least around 140,000 Muslim Rohingya are now interned effectively. We visited villages which are effectively prison villages because the Rohingya there cannot leave. And we visited Ong Mingala ghetto, which was featured in your report earlier. And what we found was a very desperate situation, in fact. We found, the question that we went out with was to explore whether or not the persecution which we knew the Rohingya to be suffering was in fact genocide. And what we found was in fact genocide. For our purposes, genocide is a process, and it seems very clear to us that the Rohingya are facing the fourth stage in the genocidal process, the stage before mass annihilation.
Well, what evidence do you have of that?
The evidence we have, we collected in the course of our research. We wanted to find out what was happening to the Rohingya, and we wanted to compare what was happening to them with historical records in relation to previous genocides. So we used the genocides against the Jews, the genocide against the Cambodians, the Rwandans, as a benchmark, in effect, to understand what we were witnessing in Myanmar, in Rakhine State. And the evidence we found was that the first stage of a genocidal process is stigmatization. And the Rohingya have been brutally stigmatized and dehumanized. They have been subject to very vicious hate campaigns, led often by the Sangha, the Buddhist monks, but backed in large part by the government.
Let's get the view now from our other guest, Tun Kin. You fled Myanmar. Just briefly explain why you had to do that.
We are facing, especially, is that genocidal process is not going last 2012. It's been going many decades, actually. People did not know in the world. For example, actually, if you look at the past, like for my grandfather was a parliamentary secretary. I am not a citizen of Burma. Particularly in many decades, after 1962, General Lewin took power, he stripped up our ethnic rights and then citizenship rights, and then he imposed restriction of movement, marriage, education, and pushing us to the camps by creating popular violence and burning down the Rohingya houses. For example, when I was in Burma, I have faced the restriction of movement, marriage, education. For example, my friends who married separately, they were sentenced to jail. We need to wait 2 to 3 years to get permission to get married. And after passing O-level, we cannot go to the higher education, university. And also, our lands were confiscated by military. This is what we faced many decades in Burma until today. Even today, the worst situation we are facing in 21st century, where what international legal experts, especially what Penny Green have mentioned, International State Crime Initiative, that genocide we are facing today. We are the worst situation in 21st century where international community is ignoring this issue.
Right.
That's what I could say.
All right, let's just return to Penny Green. We were talking earlier about the election, a landmark election, really, in Myanmar's history. Aung San Suu Kyi's National League for Democracy party won by a landslide. Is this move towards democracy going to make any difference for the Rohingya?
Well, unfortunately, I fear not at this stage. We haven't seen anything from the NLD or from Aung San Suu Kyi to indicate that there is any optimism for the Rohingya or for changing the situation that they are currently experiencing. And I think Aung San Suu Kyi was a democracy icon, but she's been absolutely silent on the question of the Rohingya. During the election campaigning, she was in Rakhine State, campaigning for the NLD. She didn't speak to a single Rohingya person. She didn't visit the camps. The NLD refused to stand a single Muslim candidate. Now, Muslims occupy around 5 to 8% of the Burmese population and have always been represented in Parliament in previous elections. So the signs aren't very encouraging. The NLD has decided not to make the Rohingya a priority. They've been quite explicit about that.
But more than that, you've actually accused Aung San Suu Kyi of being complicit in genocide. Do you still stand by that claim?
Well, I think the question has to be asked. At what point do you accede to prejudice, to persecution, to racism? And at what point do you stand up against it? And I'm afraid that if you are presiding over a country in which genocide is taking place, and the evidence is, I think, irrefutable, and you're presiding over that country, presiding over a politics which is allowing this form of persecution to take place, then I think you bear a considerable responsibility. So yes, I do still stand by that claim.
Do you agree with that analysis?
Yes, I totally agree. I think, especially for NLD government, it is early to say. From my opinion, we have to wait and see. We are quite concerned. Unfortunately, Aung San Suu Kyi is an icon for Burma and in the world, but she did not speak up what's happening to the Rohingya since 2012. It is very worrying. Especially if you look at the situation in Burma, western part of Burma, 1.3 million Rohingyas are facing genocide, what international legal experts have mentioned. So if you look at democratization in Burma, you have to look as a whole Burma. What's happening in the other western part of Burma, the 1.3 million Rohingya population are facing these situations.
Penny Green, just to go back to you, because you have a very strong legal background, can you tell us why the United Nations hasn't called what's going on in Myanmar genocide? And if they or another authority does declare it such, would it lead to changes, some sort of action perhaps against Myanmar?
Well, I can't see the United Nations or the international community of states defining what's happening in Rakhine State as a genocide anytime soon, I'm afraid. I think there's a general reluctance in the international community to use the term genocide, because once you call a particular form of persecution of the kind that genocide is a genocide, then there is an obligation on the part of states to act. There's an obligation under international law to both prevent and to punish those perpetrating the genocide. And that places states under an obligation which they are quite reluctant to pursue. And I think it's really important for your listeners to understand that genocide is actually a process. It's not simply the act of extermination.
Okay.
Genocide takes place, as Tun Kin mentioned, over decades very often. And we've seen this taking place. And in order to understand it as a process, also enables us to intervene at certain stages to prevent the very final stages of genocide taking place.
Let's just go back to Tun Kin for a moment. Now, you've spoken in the UK's Parliament, to the United States Congress and the European Parliament. Did you find the politicians were taking your concerns seriously?
Unfortunately, I should say the US, UK, EU, UN, they are not doing enough. If you look at the situation since 2012, the situation not getting better, instead getting worse. If you look at what's happened in 2014 Dushuriadan massacre and the census which was supported by EU and other countries, Rohingya were excluded. And again, MSF and 8 groups were kicked out in 2014 March. And if you look at 2015 election, Rohingya were not allowed to vote, and they didn't allow to be a candidate of the parliament, the first time in a history. So I really think that it is not enough at all, and international community have to come with a stronger immediate action.
Right.
Otherwise, the Rohingya whole minority will be, wiped out very soon in Burma.
Penny Green, just one final thought from you. One of Aung San Suu Kyi's most eminent biographers have said that in mitigation, in her defence, she has often been portrayed by the military establishment as a foreigner for having married an Englishman, having had 2 children with him and so on, and that her position was tenuous, and that if she had noticeably sided with the Rohingya, they may have undermined her and prevented her from moving the country in the democratic way. Do you think that is sufficient mitigation for her to remain silent?
No, I don't think it's sufficient mitigation. I understand the argument that is raised, and I understand that many people have said, well, I think she's biding her time, that she will stand up for human rights more generally in Myanmar once she has been elected to a position of power. The NLD are now in government, but of course the military retains a very firm control over the democratic process and over politics generally in Myanmar. They reserve 25% of the parliamentary seats for the military. The military currently are in control of 3 crucial ministries: Home Affairs, Border Affairs and Defence. So that argument will always pertain. And I do think that if Aung San Suu Kyi had stood up, she may have lost votes. If she had stood up for the Rohingya, had stood up against the Islamophobia which is rife throughout Myanmar, had she stood up and said that we must end the persecution that's taking place in Rakhine State, she might have lost some votes. But I think, given her former moral and political capital, she would have taken many civil society activists and the general population with her. And I think that's a great shame and an enormously grave lost opportunity.
Penny Green and Tun Kin, both of you in London, thank you very much for your contribution to the Newsmakers.
Thank you.
Still to come on the Newsmakers, no government, no prime minister, no bailout, while Ukrainian politics are on hold. And then picture this, deserted streets as a curfew comes into force in India-administered Kashmir. Ukraine has been paralysed by months of political chaos, corruption allegations and infighting that has frozen the release of much-needed Western aid. But just how dangerous is Ukraine's political impasse? The Newsmakers Sandra Gathmann takes a look at the country's many battles ahead.
Political infighting and public scandal, Russian aggression and a separatist insurgency in the east, and a shrinking economy. Ukraine is facing its biggest political shakeup since the 2014 Maidan uprising, when a pro-Western government was brought in to fight corruption and stand up to pro-Russian rebels. Then, the resignation announcement from an embattled prime minister.
Despite the circumstances, absurd situation, and unreasonable accusations, I presented an anti-crisis plan. I have told the president and parliament that I will no longer hold on to my position.
Since then, the Ukrainian parliament has struggled to form a new coalition, and time is fast running out. The biggest delay is over who will get the top jobs. The man tipped for the position of Prime Minister is Volodymyr Groysman, Speaker of the Parliament and an ally of President Poroshenko. The current Finance Minister is Natalie Jaresko, an American-born banker. She's been credited with improving Ukraine's economy, but is unlikely to stay. And there's still no agreement on who will lead the economy, energy, culture, and health ministries. Prime Minister Yatsenyuk's People's Front Party has struggled to lead a coalition with Poroshenko's Solidarity Bloc. mainly over differences in how to reform Ukraine's economy. Ukraine is battling deep recession, hurt by low consumer demand and a trade war with Russia. Last year, Ukraine's GDP shrank by almost 10%. Foreign aid has helped, but the International Monetary Fund is delaying badly needed loans until a new cabinet is formed. Further delays could lead to snap parliamentary elections, forcing a new electoral standoff in a country already fighting many battles. Sandra Gathmann, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from Kiev to discuss Ukraine's political crisis is journalist and Ukraine expert Johannes Andersen. Mr. Andersen, thank you very much for joining us on The Newsmakers. Just briefly, who do you think will end up replacing the Prime Minister?
Well, I think that Volodymyr Groysman still has a very good chance. He's current head of parliament, and he is, as you also said, an ally of Poroshenko, the president.
Do you think that's a problem for Ukrainian democracy?
Well, it might be, but there's a slight reason for optimism, because the recent dragging out of this whole process the last 2 or 3 days might actually not only be because of corrupt horse trading, as many has spoken about, but also because this new candidate for the head of government, he seemed actually to be fighting to get an independent position, independent of the president, while the president is trying to control him, putting in vice prime ministers to control both politics and also corrupt money streams maybe. And then the Groysman is standing up for himself.
Okay, and another key position may also be filled by a presidential ally. We're talking about the finance ministry here. Just explain why you think a very well-renowned finance minister, Natalia Yaresko, could be pushed out and another Poroshenko ally put in her place.
Well, it's the biggest problem with Ukrainian politics, that it's more about economics, it's more about corruption than about politics sometimes. She's seen as very uncorrupt. She's also quite unpopular in the population because she has been presiding over some unpopular reforms, but she has actually been in securing loan debt reductions for Ukraine on the international debt markets. It's been crucial for this effectively bankrupt country, and she would be a brilliant candidate, I would think, and many Westerners think, for leading the government. But she's simply too uncorrupt for the president.
That's interesting. Let's talk about the IMF and other Western money that's being held up by this political impasse. What's the effect on Ukraine?
Well, the immediate effect of this whole crisis, of course, is that the currency has lost up to 70% of its value. While and it should actually be a boost for the economy, because it would make Ukrainian goods much cheaper on the export markets. But with a trade war from Russia and an ongoing war in the east, the economy is not picking up at all, and that's also a sign that the structural problems in the economy are enormous.
Okay, Johannes Andersen from Kiev, thank you very much for joining us on the Newsmakers. Now, in today's Picture This, authorities have imposed a curfew in parts of India-administered Kashmir in an attempt to bring an end to mounting anti-India demonstrations. It follows the death of several people, reportedly from Indian Army gunfire. Let's take a look. Today's newsmaker has been Myanmar's Aung San Suu Kyi, as we asked if she can change the fate of the Rohingya Muslim minority. Her National League for Democracy holds power after decades of military rule. She says she wants to push through democratic reforms quickly. But will they include the Rohingya? Her detractors say no and point to her silence on the matter so far. But her supporters argue that any public intervention from her will only cause greater tension in the country. What is clear, though, is that a democracy, by definition, must be inclusive of all its people. And for Myanmar, that must mean changes in how the Rohingya are treated. You've been watching this edition of the Newsmakers with me, Matthew Moore. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.